associate DevOps with continuous integration, automating the build and deployment pipeline. But I like to define DevOps as delivering high quality software faster, which is about flow, which is about how do we apply lean manufacturing techniques into IT so that we're able to go as fast as humanly possible with high quality. And if you look at an agile team, in typical organizations, while that team might be responsible for development and testing, but they need help when it comes to implementing a new environment, or maybe deploying the code. Maybe they need to reach out to architecture when they have a new solution. They have somebody else who's doing the production support and answering incidents, and then they need special help when it comes to security and perf testing. So all of these outside resources become impediments and things that the Agile team has to wait for. And so DevOps, this philosophy, is about how do we take those people that we have that are outside the Agile team, and how do we enable the Agile pod to be able to do that on their own behalf with the right level of risk and autonomy. And we can't just give up, here's full access to all of the environments and the networks, and so you, the Agile team, you go ahead and go create whatever environments you want, however you want. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is enablement. How does the infrastructure team, for example, how did they enable the Agile team to be able to stand up a new environment with the right prerequisites in an automated fashion, meeting all of the security requirements that we have in the company? From a production support perspective, how do we engage the Agile team and make them accountable for supporting what they're building so that they know how the customer is using the application and what issues are being found, and make them accountable for fixing that stuff? How do we enable them to do their own security and performance testing and bring in a shared resource when there's a problem that they just can't solve for? That's what DevOps is. It's about delivering high quality software faster, and constantly looking at all of those impediments that we have to wait for, that we can't do ourselves, and enabling that Agile pod to do that. Many times, DevOps is a piece of this journey. So we start with Agile, and Agile definitely gets us moving faster. At one company that I was at, they were very happy when they went to Agile, because they went from quarterly releases to about 6-week releases. And so, hey, that's great. We've cut our release time in half. And that's true, but all they were doing was, shorter waterfall iterations. And so when we apply some of this DevOps mindset and capabilities to an Agile team, they are going to get faster. And so it's just the next step of their maturity here to get them to be able to start delivering every sprint. And ultimately, the goal is to get to continuous delivery. Now, I talk about continuous delivery versus continuous deployment because continuous deployment is the ability to have code just go all the way right into production and be active. And there's not a lot of companies that are truly doing that. There typically is a last minute gate for the business to approve that change, to be validated, that it can go, maybe you use blue-green deployments or canary builds. And so continuous delivery is that automated process so that code can go all the way up to be production ready, but then there's some manual process step to make it fully active. And that's typically what's most reasonable at companies who are practicing this. So this is the continuum that we're moving towards. Okay, so what makes up DevOps? What are those high-level tenets that are part of this overarching philosophy? The first one is around automating everything. Like I said before, we don't want to have to wait for people to do work on behalf of the team. We need the team to be empowered to do it themselves, and And in order for them to be able to do it themselves without having all of the subject matter expertise, it needs to be automated. The build process needs to be automated so that when a developer checks in code, the build is automatically triggered. They don't need to know necessarily how to do all the compiles themselves, but they need to know what the process is so that when they check their code in, the build will properly happen, and need to know how to look at the results in order to triage if the build fails. The same thing from the merges. Merges, depending on what source code system that you're using, merges have to be ongoing and happening dynamically within your source code management tool. We can't have somebody sitting outside of the development team who's manually merging code and reconciling differences. So we need to have everything automated around that critical path in order to maximize our flow. This is a picture from Toyota. This is the andon cord. Edward Deming and Toyota realized that it was much better to stop the line when they found the defect than wait till the very end when the car was done to then do testing and discover something was wrong and try to go back and fix it. And the same thing here, we need to know as soon as possible that something doesn't work. So how do we help tell the developers that something doesn't work, as quick as possible to their code check-in? We can't have them write code and then wait a couple days for that code to get deployed into a test environment, and then we run some manual tests and then wait a little longer for the regression and security and performance. Because many times if we find something that late in the game, the developer has already moved on. They're maybe unaware of what they changed a couple weeks ago. And so we need to be able to have a system where we're able to tell the developer something doesn't work as quick as possible. And oh, by the way, everybody needs to have visibility when something doesn't work. Many times we're relying on defect tracking systems to communicate with people. And so how do we do this so that a developer can't continue because it's broken and they have to fix it, rather than having to wait on some intermediary system? Because again, that's just an impediment. We have to be able to remove constraints in the sense that if we're trying to move as quickly as possible through this automated workflow, if we have requirements that say I need to test this on different browsers or different mobile devices, or we have a third-party API, but that API is not available, we need to be able to virtualize those integration points, those other systems, those different browsers and devices. We need to be able to emulate and virtualize them so that we can test and develop against them as early as possible. If you have, if one team is building a UI, another team is building the API, a lot of times they're working in parallel. And so they can't test what the other is going to be doing because it's still being developed. And so how do we enable them to have a harness which allows each of them to develop and test in full, so when that does come together, we can just do the happiest of paths and not have to redo all of our tests. I mentioned this a little bit, but we need to be talking. Many times we set up processes and activities because we don't trust and we're not communicating. One great example of this is UAT, user acceptance testing. Many times I talk to companies and they're doing user acceptance testing, and that user acceptance testing is almost as big as the testing effort. And it's because they're not talking to each other, and the business isn't involved earlier on in the process. The IT QA testers are not testing the same things that are important to the business, and the business is finding stuff when they do that acceptance testing. But that acceptance testing is just another gate, another impediment that's slowing us down. And so we need to be talking and collaborating early on so that we don't need to do a long-running user acceptance phase. How does acceptance happen every day during the sprint? And so what we're trying to get here is this pipeline, if you will, of code moving through all of the different activities that are required in order to get it to production. So going from version control to being built to running unit tests, deploying, running your automated tests, functional tests, integration tests end to end, security, performance, and just kind of repeating that process until you're ready to get to production. And the whole time we have visibility into this process. And when something doesn't work, everybody is alerted and notified. This is where we're trying to go. And by focusing on getting to this pipeline, we can be knocking down those constraints and impediments that are slowing us down and creating waste in our process. And we will become more efficient and productive as we're able to implement and knock those things down. So at a high level, we start with Agile and starting with that transition. And then from a DevOps perspective, it's there's 3 pillars that we'd like to talk about. The first one is continuous integration. And so that pipeline, that automate everything, the backbone is continuous integration, which means that you're constantly, your code check-ins are being compiled and unit tested and being merged into master or mainline, every day, multiple times a day. So that's that process and that CI tool, a continuous integration tool like Jenkins or Bamboo, for example, or GitLab, that becomes your backbone of your assembly line. And then that second pillar is continuous testing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's, to me, continuous testing is that act that every test that I need to do to certify that code, it's automated and it's part of my pipeline, and the results of those tests are driving the next steps in the pipeline. So it's that full circle that's happening, automated and integrated into the pipeline that gives us continuous testing. And so we'll talk about how do you enable that. And then monitoring, having the visibility into this entire process so that the team is able to understand how the pipeline is behaving, what is our flow, do we have any bottlenecks that we need to fix, how is our quality and our productivity, and then ultimately with some technical enablers, do you have a monolithic application? Have you been able to break it down into microservices? Have you loosely coupled some of the things that you're dependent on? Those technical enablers or blockers, depending on how you look at it, knocking them down with DevOps and Agile is going to get you to continuous delivery. So this is what we're shooting for. All right, so what is continuous testing? I kind of talked about it a little bit, but it starts with that pipeline. The pipeline is the backbone of our assembly line. So again, everything that we do is going to be triggered by that pipeline. In our picture, I made it pretty simple that, hey, there's one pipeline, but it's really a series of pipelines, because you'll have a pipeline for developers as they're working on their branch, checking in their code. You're going to have a series of tests that will be associated with their local code, like unit tests and some static security scans. And then once their code goes through those that first level of tests, maybe they'll do a pull request, and then you'd have another set of pipeline runs for all the pull requests that get approved, and then you'll have the larger running pipeline to then move the code from development all the way through to production. But understanding that the CI tool and how to work with it, how to integrate your test to it, how to make sure that it understands your results, that is the backbone of everything that we're going to be talking about, especially for continuous testing. The next is real-time automation. We no longer can be automating just our regression tests. It's too late. And when we create new regression tests, they have the maximum value at that point, and then their value diminishes over time. And so to spend majority of our time just automating regression doesn't really make a lot of sense. Instead, we need to be automating as close to the developer as possible. And so that might mean that we have to change the tooling that we use for automation. Might mean that we have to change the skills that our testers have in able to do this. So there's three different types of automation that we talk about here. The first one is BDD, and this is really more around the product owner from the business, the developer, maybe a BA if you have one, and the tester, all sitting down together as part of the story grooming and coming up with acceptance tests for the stories. And so we call that meeting the meeting of the three amigos. Typically, they use a language called Gherkin to write those acceptance tests. And Gherkin is a format called given, when, then. And so by having that meeting up front, we get alignment between development, the business, and testing on what's really needed. And that helps ensure that the developer is developing against exactly what the business is asking. We're going to go test exactly what the business is asking, what the developer is building, and we're all talking. And if you look at defects today, many times you see that we're logging defects because of misunderstandings and the lack of communication. And so BDD really helps bridge those gaps and get us talking early and often. Test-driven development, whether you do true test-driven development, which means you're writing unit tests first, and those unit tests fail, and then you write code to make those unit tests pass. Whether you do that or not, people have different opinions. My opinion is it matters that you have unit tests and you have thresholds in your pipeline that don't allow code to move forward unless you've satisfied those thresholds. So ideally, we're above 90% code coverage in our unit tests, and they're passing. But I understand, teams are still working to improve this, and so you might have to start at a much lower threshold as you get better at doing this. But unit tests are critical. They're our first line of defense, and we need to have them with every piece of code that's written. And then lastly, you have acceptance test-driven development. So this is taken the Gherkin scenario acceptance tests from BDD, and now it's aligning them to automated tests. So typically you'll see tools like Cucumber and Gherkin, Cucumber and Selenium, where we are able to align the automated test directly to the Cucumber feature files and the scenarios within the feature files. And so this helps us make sure that we're automating what the business has specified as far as the requirements for the story. And so all three of these help us keep pace with developers so that when a developer is ready to check in their code, they can run the automated acceptance tests locally to make sure they're passing. We can be working together to make sure that we have working code and working tests. And that becomes a part of our definition of done for the stories now, is that when I'm checking in code, I'm checking in working tests and working code together. As part of moving to real-time automation, the approach to testing has to change. Many times we spend a lot of time manually testing the UI. And we do that because as testers, we have a lot more business knowledge than we do technical knowledge. And it's easier to test the UI because that's what the business is speaking than it is the service layer or some of the lower components. The problem is taking that same approach and then moving to automation. The UI is the thing that's changing the most. It's typically the most complex thing to automate, and those tests are slow to run and they break often. So what ends up happening is you build out this automated suite that becomes a bear to maintain. And frankly, that's why many people only automate regression, because at that point, the UI is stable enough to write your automation and it's less flaky. But for what we're trying to do with being able to run tests every day, multiple times a day, running them through the UI is just not going to give you the benefits. And so when you move to real-time automation or continuous testing, we need to have component level automation. We need to make sure that We are testing our APIs separately from the UI. Sure, like we do want to do some level of end-to-end testing and integration testing, but we need to be breaking our system down into those components and building our automation by those components. And so that does require that we have deeper conversations with our developers so that we can understand how the APIs work. You know, are there WSDLs or design documents that we are able to use in order to build those tests? How do we make sure that those tests are automated? How do we stage them properly so that we're building in our pipeline for that suite? And there still will be, you know, some manual testing because it's just easier to do and quicker. But, you know, ideally that's not critical path for moving your application into production. As part of moving into this direction, the open source tools are right now better at being able to handle the demands of needing to run every day, multiple times a day. So things like Selenium, for example, or Appium, Protractor. These are great tools with great capabilities, with big communities that are keeping them up to date in real time. And they're just moving much faster than large third parties. The problem is that when you're using open source tools, they typically require a higher technical aptitude to use them. You need to know some level of Java or Ruby or Python enabled to use these tools. And traditionally, testers haven't had those skills, and which is why they've gone to large third parties for tooling, because those large third parties give you that abstraction layer, like a keyword-driven framework, for example, that, you know, kind of try to bridge the gap between a non-technical person and a technical person. The problem is that, again, that's an impediment. That's good. The impediment becomes that third-party software provider for that tooling, because they're not going to keep up as fast with the capabilities that you need to have. So we need to be able to use open source tools, because that's the only way we're going to get to keep pace with developers. But that is going to mean that our testers now need to be able to understand how to use Selenium. They're going to need to understand how to use Git and Jenkins or whatever CI tool you're using, testing NG. They're going to need to have those technical skills. Having manual testers who are not technical is not going to work in this model going forward. As I mentioned before, from a flow perspective, if we have requirements where we need to be able to test different browsers, different devices, well, we need to be able to solve that within our pipeline. So to be able to do continuous testing for a mobile app, well, I need to have a way to run one test against different browsers or different devices. And so there are third parties like Perfecto Mobile or Browser Stack or Sauce Labs. Even at EPAM, we have our own mobile device farm. And so you need these capabilities plugged into your pipeline, and your framework needs to support being able to take one test and be able to run it across those different systems, all in parallel, all through automation. We can't wait till the very end and then try to hit each of these separately. It's going to be a bottleneck. And again, that's everything that we're doing here is about improving flow and knocking down those bottlenecks so that we're, you know, able to run these tests every day, multiple times a day without interaction. Test data management is probably the biggest up and coming problem for companies. As we start moving faster and you want to run those tests every day, multiple times a day, data is going to be a big impediment. At one company that I was working at, we had a mainframe backend system, it's a financial company. Well, the mainframe has transaction limitations, and as soon as you use an account to do something, well, that account becomes worthless because the state of it has changed. And so, how do I dynamically have the capability to create new data on the fly, condition it, or maybe even just find the data that I need so that I can use it for my tests? And so we have to have a way to solve for test data management. Many times when we automate regression, we include the data conditioning as part of the scripts. But again, that makes our scripts long and tough to manage. And so conditioning your data has to be separate. And so you have to have this test data management strategy around how do you automate the creation of data or the conditioning of data. We typically call that synthetic data. So how do you provide your frameworks with synthetic data on demand? If many companies are still using production data, and with the new regulations coming down, obviously that has to stop, should stop regardless. And so how do we get away from using production data? And if we absolutely must use production data, how do we have an automated process to bring in that production data into a secure place, scrub it, put it into our non-prod, and then dynamically understand which scenarios in that production data do we actually need to have for testing. But frankly, that should be the bare minimum in our overall test data needs. Service virtualization is the next capability that you have to have in place in order to enable continuous testing. And it's one of those things that I've talked to people about over and over, and and I don't think people really grasp the importance of service virtualization. So let's say we have a mobile app, and it integrates to some. Let's say we're an insurance company, and it integrates to several of our policy systems. And so, of course, you're going to say, well, test data is a big constraint for me because I need policy data from these other systems to be able to properly test the mobile app. And while that definitely is the case, you can minimize that need on test data by using service virtualization and stubbing out those policy systems. If those back-end systems aren't changing, well, then you don't need to do full integration testing across all of those systems. You can use service virtualization to virtualize each one of those endpoints, and the tools today, whether you're going with a CA or Parasoft or IBM's tools, or you go the open source route with Hoverfly or Montebank, you have the capability to data drive those stubs so well that you can still run your full suite of tests. And that way, again, you're isolating the component, you're being able to hit it rigorously, and you're not having the constraint of trying to get data into systems that maybe you don't even know how to put data in. The other opportunity with service virtualization is third parties. So many times we have a third party that we're integrated with, and that third party has maybe it's it's a address lookup, or it's providing credit scores, and so obviously we have limitations on how we can test with it. And so being able to virtualize that third-party API, again, allows us to do full testing without that constraint. I mentioned that example of one team's doing a mobile UI and one team's doing the API, where you can use service virtualization to stub out the interaction between the two, so that both of them can do full development and testing as if the other was already integrated. So as you implement all of this process for continuous testing, we need that monitoring, that visualization. So Hygieia is an open source dashboard that Capital One in the US created. They just published a new version of it. But at Capital One, Hygieia allows the teams to have full insight into their build activity, the quality, the team's activity with their backlog health. And so having this dashboard up on screens where the teams are sitting or on a monitor in their laptop, being able to see the health of the pipeline in real time and be able to react accordingly is critical to improve flow and not have the team stopped and waiting for somebody. Another cool thing about Hygieia is this view that it gives you on flow. So what this allows you to do is, so each one of these is a pipeline, and what you can see is the green and red boxes are groups of commits waiting to move to the next phase. So you have, you have commits here that are waiting for a build. You have this build that's waiting for deployment, and then you have code that's sitting in dev waiting to move to QA, then what's in QA waiting to move to integration, performance, and eventually to prod. And what this allows then the leadership above the teams to see is, how are we doing from a flow perspective? Where are our bottlenecks in our process? What is the overall lead time to production? Because that's the key metric that we need to be improving, and that we're going to realize the benefits of doing all of these things. And if we don't know how long does it take for code to get through our ecosystem to get to production, well, how do we do that? And so this dashboard allows you to get that insight into the factory within IT, so that you then can lean in. When we first built these dashboards, the performance times jumped out at everybody, and that was what helped start us down the path of, well, how do we shift performance testing left and get it integrated into these earlier cycles, so that we're not spending days in performance and security testing. Okay, so I've gone through how a typical organization, the starting point of the organization, talked about DevOps and that focus on flow to improve quality. We've talked about the key components of DevOps, and then getting to continuous testing. So now, okay, you're starting, you want to go back to your company, and you want to get to implement continuous testing. So what do you do? So this is what I have done. Before I was at EPAM, I was at an insurance company. Before that, I was at a large financial institution in the US, all of which were able to implement continuous testing. And so I'm going to share some of best practices that I've put in place. So it starts with value stream analysis. So sitting down with your teams and just whiteboarding out how, okay, we get a requirement from the business. What are the next steps that have to happen in order to get that requirement developed, tested, and into production? What are all those steps? And just spending the time to whiteboard out how the donuts are made. And by doing that, what you're going to identify is, okay, well, what are those activities that are value add and we have to do? And what are the ones where we're doing this, we're waiting for somebody else to do something, this activity is not really contributing to getting the code into production, so why are we doing this? It's going to give you full insight into the waste activities of the team. It's also going to help build your business case. So people will ask me at conferences, Adam, I totally agree with everything you're saying, but I can't get my business or my IT leadership to buy into it. And my response is, go do value stream analysis. When we were starting this out at one company I was with, we sat with a team, we did value stream analysis, we went through how the donuts are made, and what we found out was that an 8-person team they were deploying code every month, they were very happy about that. But when you did this analysis and you dug into exactly all of the work that was happening, we found out that, well, one person on the team is totally dedicated to doing builds and the merges and deployments. And then you have another person who's doing automated testing, but they're automating what they deployed the previous month. And then they had very high defect leakage, meaning that the defects that made it into the next phase into production were I want to say over 40%. So now they're spending 40% of their time, or I want to say it's like 25% of their time in their backlog around technical debt and those defects and fixing that. And so when it was said and done, that 8-person team was really only doing 4 people worth of work. Well, now being able to go back to the leadership and say, hey, if you make an investment in continuous integration and the test automation activities, some of these other enablers like we talked about, service virtualization and TDM, if you make investments in those areas, well, now I can double the productivity of this team. And we can track that through the velocity and the release frequency and the production quality. Well, now, how does a leader turn that down? And because we did the value stream analysis for their team, it's in their terms, it's very specific and tangible to them. Sometimes you might do this for a digital line of business, and when you go talk to another line of business, they might say, well, that doesn't really apply to us because that's only digital. And so you do have to do this in a way that that's tailored for everybody because they need to see it in their terms. But this is how you build your backlog of what work needs to happen and how you identify the potential ROI for why this is important to do. The next thing that we've done is we need to empower people to be part of this change. Putting these processes in place not only is going to require process and tool change, but the people are going to have to change. A great example is we want to be automating in the sprint with the Agile team. But if we have an enterprise team that's doing all of the test automation, they're going to feel threatened that they're going to lose their job, that they're no longer important because we're asking the teams to take on that work. And that's really not the case. The enterprise resources now are going to be enablers. They're going to own the framework and the capability and really try to solve more technical, challenging problems, which frankly is a better use of their time than scripting. But in order for them to get bought in, to understand that, to be part of it, they have to be part of the solution. And so at several companies, what we've done is we take that backlog that comes out of the value stream analysis that helps us identify all the things that need to be different. And then we'll practice, we'll take some components from the Scaled Agile framework or SAFe, and we'll do a release planning. So we'll bring everybody from the testing team, some people from development, and maybe some people from operations together, and we'll go through that backlog and we'll segment it out. And this one example, we broke it out between Agile and waterfall processes, tooling, training, TDM, and some of our technical work around service virtualization and performance. So we themed out the potential backlog items. We self-organized into teams. And what we did is we then refined each one of those backlog items. We prioritized them, and we started to sprint. And so what we did is we used that Scaled Agile framework to then have working groups making improvements to these processes, doing demos to share across the entire testing organization around what the team was doing and what they were accomplishing. And then we used larger roadshows as a way to communicate that to the larger IT staff. And so at my previous company that I was at, after the first 3 months of working in this fashion, I want to say we did almost 200 stories of improvements in the first release. We were moving at a speed of change that people just weren't used to. But because of this mechanism, because of embracing Agile for driving internal change and using those mechanisms in Agile to communicate and socialize, there was very little resistance because we were giving people plenty of opportunities to be part of the change, see the change, and react to it instead of like forcing it down their throats. And that's really part of why you need to build a community. So I mentioned the demos. So, we want to be sharing and socializing, whether people were working in Agile or not. How do we socialize best practices to everybody? How do we help everybody understand where we're going with automation, how service virtualization applies, what a pipeline is? And so lots of demos, lots of sharing and showing people so they can better understand exactly how it will work in their terms. Lunch and learns. You need to give people time to learn and to play. And so we would do lunch and learns, every week at minimum to educate people on how things are changing. Like I talked about, the enterprise groups focusing more on enablement. And so as we started to push automation down to Agile teams, you asked the enterprise teams now set up office hours to help those Agile teams who are trying to do automation for the first time. They're there to help them understand how to make it work, how to answer any technical questions, because we need to support them. Part of the enterprise teams now is around driving that enablement. Roadshows, so once a month doing a roadshow for all of IT or IT leadership so that they can see what's happening and what's changed, and they can opt in with it and be aware and help socialize. And then the last one is around internal conferences. I can't tell you how beneficial it is to do internal conferences. Many times people in your company, they're working in silos and they think what's going on within their line of business or their team is how the whole company works. And many times the problems that they're trying to solve, other people in the company either have already solved it or are trying to do the same thing. And so internal conferences are a great way to share the work that people are doing and get them networking and talking. And the other thing is they can be great catalysts for change. So when we're at my last company, when we're trying to educate people on what DevOps is and how it applies to them, we use the open space format, which is basically it's a conference without an agenda. We have a theme, and the theme was demystifying DevOps. And so we bring 125, 150 people together in a room for a day. We do maybe a 1-hour presentation to seed their minds with the foundations. And then the open space is about them suggesting questions or topics to talk about. And then we break them out into themes. And then we spend the rest of the day in different groups, time boxed, having those conversations and working. And every time we did those, you would see an uplift in energy around the movement that we're trying to change, more interest, and they start to understand exactly what it is and how it impacts them. So when you're implementing acceptance test-driven development, service virtualization, or DevOps, these types of small local conferences are a great way to educate and energize the company around those changes. So moving to continuous testing, you're going to have challenges. Many times you're going to have the funding challenge. And so I always tell people, try to make do with the tools that you have, because as the tools are not going to be the problem. The problem is going to be the people and the change curve. And so it's about how do we enable these capabilities to educate people more, because it's going to be about the other cultural impediments that we're going to have to solve for. And I'll talk about that in a second. But so how do you make do with the tools you have? Or frankly, this is why open source is so appealing, because for the most part, open source can be free. You have to make sure that you're taking advantage of the right open source tools, because some of them have licenses that are prohibitive, meaning that if you use their tool, your product itself would have to be open source. So you need to be smart about it. You need to go through security scanning and have a process. But open source tools can give you an edge up to prove out the capability and why you need an investment if you don't have the funding. The next one is something that I've run into a couple times, which is the company's focused on project delivery. Everything is tied to delivering projects, and there is no space for learning or doing something innovative and different. And so you have to be able to identify that. You have to be able to get leadership buy-in that this is important, and they have to create space. That's why any type of enterprise change is really a bottom-up and top-down aspect of making this happen. You can't drive enterprise change without both of those things being possible. And so how do you identify that you have this mindset at your company, and how do you get leadership buy-in and to create space to be able to do innovation days once a sprint, or do those lunch and learns, or dedicate the capacity to implementing these capabilities. We talked a little bit about third parties already. When people don't know what you're doing and why, those internal conferences, those roadshows, the demos, that's a great way to handle questions or confusion on why you're doing it. And then lastly, typical QA organizations don't have a lot of those technical resources. And so you're going to need to, try to identify who they are and how do you free them up to be able to work on enabling these capabilities versus, they're doing hands-on, automating regression tests. So to do that, you really need to understand who your team is. You need to take an inventory. You need to know who are my SMEs that are really business focused. And at some point, maybe, this is obviously a long journey, but maybe at some point, those business focused SMEs on our team, maybe at some point they're going to need to move into business facing positions like a scrum master, like a product owner. And then how do we find the people on the team that are more technically, of a higher technical aptitude, that we can train a little bit and get them to embrace these, because those are the people that we're going to need more of and who are going to help us going forward. It's important that we have technologists as people managers and leaders of your groups. If your management are just people managers, they're not going to be able to effectively communicate why these things are important. Why is DevOps important? Why is it important that we transform the testing? Why is service virtualization so important? The dashboarding, etc. They're not going to be able to talk and sell and get buy-in from their partners if they don't understand how the technology works. And so just like your team has to change, your leadership has to change. They have to be more technical. They have to understand how these capabilities work and how to implement them for you to be successful. And then that's just the theme in general, is that we need to be more technical. If you have a managed service agreement, that is a good lever where you can rely on them to bring more technical resources to the team. I know at EPAM, part of our differentiator is that most of our resources are engineers. And so that's something that we can give uplift right away. At some companies I've been at where we've had to train several thousand manual testers on how to do automation. And the problem is the success rate is not very high. Maybe it's 40, 50% of resources will be able to do it and the others won't. You need to provide training for people so that the ones that do have the aptitude have the ability to get the education needed so that they can upskill themselves, because you want them to learn about automation. You want them to be able to learn about the different tools that I've talked about. And then the other thing that I tell people is, if you have recs today for manual testers, go close them. You should not hire any manual testers going forward. Use your recs to inject technical resources into your teams who understand these capabilities. You might not be fully ready to embrace everything, but new hires are your best opportunity to inject your team with the right skill set. And so you don't want to miss the boat because you're trying to find a SME who understands how this part of the business works. You can find somebody else in the business to take that role on for now and teach them some of the testing aspects that they need. But to bring on those technical resources who understand Selenium or understand how the pipeline works, that's an opportunity that you have that you just shouldn't pass up. I briefly talked about this a little bit, but the goal now is for your enterprise teams to be focused on enablement. Infrastructure needs to be focused on how do we provide containers and automated patterns so that our developers can push a button and spin up a new environment that meets most of the criteria that they need. Okay, we no longer should an enterprise team do work on behalf of an Agile team or anybody. That's when we talk about how to apply DevOps to your testing organization. It's a big part of that is looking at what do we need to do as part of our jobs to ensure quality. What aspect of that do we have to rely on somebody else to do? And for those activities, how do we enable the team to do that for themselves? And so that means building out that tooling, that automation, those frameworks, so that the teams can be self-servicing and doing it themselves. And then also having the mechanism to provide support, office hours, the conferences, daily meetups. Now the enterprise team, their success is based on people using their tools and the satisfaction, the net promoter score of the teams with their support. And then from a team perspective, obviously we're focusing on flow. How do we improve our lead times? How do we raise the quality? And and be able to move faster and get rid of that hardening phase that we typically have. And so I mentioned this, we need to remove the impediments and the constraints that are on the teams. Typically, it's around automation and performance. Test data is one of those things. We want to be able to empower the Agile team to be able to do these things themselves without having to rely on others. You need to pilot, do POCs all the time. You need to be showing people how this technology works, how it will benefit them. They need to see it in their own terms. A lot of, I mentioned service virtualization. You can talk about service virtualization till you're blue in the face, but until somebody actually sees it in action, they won't buy in. At my last company, we talked about service virtualization, but it wasn't until we implemented service virtualization in our IVR system, and we're able to show people that we could save them 5 days every month by implementing service virtualization, that all of a sudden they got it. And now they're writing a check to implement it in more places. And so you have to do those pilots. You have to understand what will work for your company and what will resonate with people, so that and that's how you learn how to apply these techniques and what's going to work for you. From a metrics perspective, there's a company called D.O.R.A, DevOps Research and Assessment. Gene Kim, Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, they lead this company. And what they've been able to do is they've taken a DevOps survey and they've distilled the data in that survey into these 4 key metrics. And so lead time, so how long that commit takes to get to production, how often are you deploying, if you have a production incident, how long does it take you to recover, and what % of your production changes fail. These are the 4 core metrics that you need to baseline and show your trends in order to then tell your story. So at my previous company, lead times were typically greater than 50 days at a time. We did about, I want to say, 400 deployments a month, and 70% of them were successful. So we had definitely good ammunition to go back to our senior leaders to show them how implementing these practices were going to improve those metrics. And by improving these metrics, not only are we getting more productive, but it means we can do more for our business. So getting your business part of this conversation is key, because most likely they already get it. Like, they're already screaming for more and more stuff. And so if you can educate them on DevOps and how the improvement in testing is going to help, they will help champion this with you, with your IT leaders. And frankly, to be successful, everything probably needs to start with the business, because they're the ones typically paying for IT. And then just some things that I've seen. So even when we were early on in adopting continuous testing, we were able to see that we were able to deploy much faster. We saw drastic reduction in our production incidents. I want to say that we were probably about 10% into all of the applications in production, getting them to adopt continuous testing. And just by doing 10% of our applications, we had tripled the number of deployments in production overall. And for those applications, for the first 3 months, there was 0 production incidents. So, this stuff really does work. It's not, just smoke and mirrors. It will provide benefits. And then, as I said, so your structure of the team will probably still stay the same, right? You're focused by line of business, but now you've empowered those line of business teams to do almost everything themselves. And so from an enterprise perspective, you have the tools